Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. We're going to explore interspecies communication today, and with me is Professor Christian de Quincey, who is the Dean of Consciousness Studies at the University of Philosophical Research. He's also a faculty member at John F. Kennedy University and Sophia University. He is the founder and director of the Wisdom Academy and author of numerous books, including Radical Nature, Radical Knowing, Consciousness from Zombies to Angels, Deep Spirit, Cracking the Noetic Code, a novel that we'll be talking about today, and Blindspots. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Good to see you.
Good to be with you. Now, it's interesting that you're a philosopher and you've written 4 books of nonfiction and 1 book that's fictional, and as you described it to me, that book came out in a flood. You wrote a 400-page novel in 2 weeks.
Yes, it's a novel that I first started writing years ago, in fact, around the mid-1970s, and then wrote about 40 pages, and then put it aside got on with other projects. And then around 2000, I revisited the idea. I had a 2-week vacation over the Christmas period, and I was living up among the redwood trees in Half Moon Bay, and I sat down, and within 2 weeks, 400 pages just poured out of me, and I realized this was something that needed to be expressed.
It's, in a way, it's like channeling, I suppose.
Well, that's what people have said to me. It's been said that Christian channeled a dolphin when he was writing this book, and at the time I thought, well, that's a cute phrase, but actually later on I realized it might have been way more accurate than I had assumed at the time.
Because the novel Deep Spirit involves a scientist who is receiving communications from a dolphin.
Correct. He's working with an anthropologist who's researching interspecies communication at the University of Hawaii, and the romantic element in the story is he falls in love with her, and she takes and introduces him to this dolphin. He's a scientist researching extraterrestrial communication, the possibility of that, and he realizes that there's this woman in Hawaii who is doing research with interspecies communication, and that if he can learn something from her work with dolphins, that might be useful to him if and when they discover intelligent life outside our solar system.
Well, I know we both have a lot to say about interspecies communication, but an important part of your story is that sometime, I think 6 months or so after you had this experience of 400 pages coming through you so rapidly in 2 weeks, you attended a shamanistic workshop yourself that involved interspecies communication.
That's correct. I participated in a shamanic workshop, a shamanic journey, and during that I was visited by a dolphin that identified himself as the main dolphin character in the story, and the dolphin's name is Darwin. I was surprised to learn in that communication with this dolphin in my shamanic journey that he and his colleagues had selected me to write this story, and that was the reason that so much came out within that 2-week period of 400 pages, for me to communicate to the human species some important ideas that he and his colleagues felt humans need to be aware of to wake up to the relationship between cetaceans, dolphins, and whales and the human species.
And in your novel, an important message that's coming through, it has to do with the ecology of the planet.
Well, very much so. That one of the main messages in the story, but also in this communication I had with this dolphin in the shamanic journey, was that we have to get over the idea that humans are special. the idea that we are special creatures because we have these brains that give us consciousness and that somehow that makes us unique on the planet is a myth, and a very dangerous myth, and that it's responsible for our relationship to the rest of the environment, that we don't relate to the natural world as possessing its own intelligence, its own feeling, its own meaning, and as a result we tend to rape the environment. And of course, as we now know today, the consequences of that attitude to the natural world are very serious.
A very important message, no doubt. But at this point, I can imagine that some of our viewers are thinking, we've gone off the deep end. This is very new agey. What we're talking about, shamanic journeys, communication with dolphins about ecology. It's all, frankly, psychological projection and fantasy. So we have to unpack that very carefully. We need to look at how does one distinguish between an authentic interspecies communication and a human projection anthropomorphizing another species.
That's very true, and to be, as a philosopher, I have to be responsible for the communication of my ideas. And I realize I'm taking a certain risk in going public with these ideas of having communication, telepathic communication with a dolphin. But I got to say that during that experience, the sense of certainty of the reality of the presence of this being was, during that time, just as real, in fact more real, than the feeling that you are real to me sitting here in front of me right now. So that raises the question of how do we decide what is real? How do we decide between hallucination and imagination and visitation and the presence of some other beings, perhaps from some other dimension? To reject that possibility out of hand, I think, is irresponsible. To just accept it on face value would be equally irresponsible. So what I'm interested in is exploring the subjective experience of what actually happened and honoring that for what it is.
Very important, especially coming from the perspective that I know you take from our previous discussions. We've done a prior interview on the topic of intersubjectivity, and the notion of radical empiricism developed by William James is very important to you, that your own inner experience is a form of empirical evidence, probably the most direct empirical evidence possible.
In fact, I think that is the only direct empirical evidence, is that science likes to talk about objective knowledge, objective evidence. And when people say that, they tend to overlook the fact that every single piece of scientific evidence that has ever existed first occurred in the subjective experience of the scientist who was doing the investigation. So all science begins with subjective experience. To then minimize or invalidate subjective experience undermines the entire scientific enterprise. So we have to begin by acknowledging the validity of subjective experience. William James talked about radical empiricism, and by that he meant that evidence and knowledge isn't something that just comes through the senses and not data that are just analyzed by logic and reason. We do have other ways of knowing, like feeling and intuitions, and they are valid ways of knowing too. And basically in my work, not just in my novel, but in my other work, philosophical works, I take the position that if we are ever going to achieve true interspecies communication, we're going to have to cultivate other ways of knowing beyond the senses and linguistic communication, telepathy, feeling, intuition.
Well, as a parapsychologist myself, I appreciate the value of conventional empirical evidence. If there's some sort of what we call veridical information that you receive that could be verified externally in the conventional ways of the sort that might stand up in a courtroom, for example, is highly valued in science and in particular in parapsychology. And when it comes to interspecies communication, and in particular communication between humans and dolphins, there's some interesting data that really supports the sort of experiences that you've had. And I'd like to share some of that, if I may.
I'd love to hear that, yes.
One of my old friends is a naturalist from New Zealand. His name is Wade Doak, and he's published several books. One of those books is called Dolphin. And he describes in this book a situation in which, and he had a catamaran, a boat that could go out in the ocean. And on one occasion, he was out with a group of friends in the ocean, and one of his friends was sitting at the edge of the boat, and a dolphin jumped out of the water and looked him right in the eye for just a moment, and then went back into the water. And his friend said to him, "Wow," he said, "I had an experience as if a pinball machine were going off in my head when that happened. All sorts of lights and sounds." He said it was amazing. Nothing like it has ever happened to me before. And that night, Wade Doak had a dream. And in the dream, he was in the water, and a dolphin spoke to him. And the dolphin said a word, an actual word. The word was tapuhi. And also in the dream, he was surrounded by dolphins. They were all swimming around him in a figure-8 pattern. So he went to a shaman. He actually filmed this. It's all recorded on film. He went to the Maori shamans of New Zealand, and he told them the dream. And the shaman said, well, in the Maori language, that word, tapuhi, is a word that means the sound that dolphins make when they're blowing water out of their blowhole. And Wade thought this, dolphins are trying to communicate with us. So he got a film crew together. He took his catamaran way out into the ocean looking for dolphins. It took them about 2 weeks. And he had cameras, he had loudspeakers, he did extensive work to communicate with dolphins. And they didn't find any dolphins for a long time. But at one point, and this is captured on film, he is in the water, and he, sounds will carry a long distance underwater. He said that word, tapuhi, and at that moment, captured on film, in the horizon, all 360 degrees around the boat, dozens and dozens of dolphins leapt up into the air and then came back into the water, and then they formed a figure-8 formation and swam around him just as he had dreamt.
Fascinating.
So the dolphins were very clearly providing evidence of human-dolphin interaction and communication. I have personally had similar experiences. I won't go into them now, but all of this adds a lot of credibility to the idea that your novel that felt to you in a shamanistic journey as if it involved human-dolphin communication, it would be consistent with these kinds of experiences.
Very much so, and in other conversations that I've had with you at other times, we've spoken about the philosophy of panpsychism and intersubjectivity, as you mentioned, and the experiences that you've just described, and my own experiences, are very consistent with that perspective, where all beings have consciousness and are communicating telepathically and are sharing meaning and have purposes and intentions and goals, and essentially to maximize the experience of satisfaction is the common aim and purpose of all sentient beings. Therefore, if something is going wrong in one species or multiple species or the environment in general, there's going to be a lot of motivation for the various species involved in that to communicate and say, look, what's happening here? We need to take some action to redress the problems that are happening. And as I said earlier in a conversation today, to me, I trace the root of the problem to the myth that humans are special, that we need to give up the idea that only humans have consciousness and that only humans have intelligence, and to realize that all species have consciousness and intelligence.
A lot of people derive these ideas from a biblical passage that talks about humans having dominion. And I think people interpret that to mean domination.
Well, yes, and I've met many very well-meaning people who also feel very uncomfortable with the idea of humans dominating nature and other species, and they prefer to say we are stewards of the environment, stewards of nature. And I stop and I think, don't think it's an improvement over domination, but I think the idea that we are stewards of the environment, stewards of nature, is a form of covert domination. That who elected the human species to be the stewards of all other species? Well, of course, the answer is pretty obvious. Humans did. There was no colloquium of all species to have a vote to say which species should we elect to the position of being stewards of the planet. Of course, it never happened. So there's a certain self-serving component to the idea of humans being stewards of the planet. I don't think we are stewards. I think we are co-participants with all other species in the ecology of the planet.
Well, it does seem to me that we have done more damage to the planet than any other species, probably by far, and that we're living in an era. It's hard to tell because in a way it goes so slowly, but it's an era of mass extinction.
Yeah.
It's happening very rapidly now, and it's largely happening as a result of human activity.
Well, that's true, and I've had many conversations with colleagues and other people about this idea of humans as special, and it seems to be, when I challenge that idea, it seems to be something that triggers a reaction. And I've had conversations where I said, well, if it's really important for you to hold on to the idea that humans are special, do so. But then I want you to also at least consider this possibility, that all species are special. In some ways, every species is unique. That's what identifies us as distinct species. So yes, humans are special, dolphins are special, dogs are special, worms are special, bees are special. And the point I want to make is that there's nothing especially special about human specialness.
Well, humans have a way of highly prizing some species. Lions, dolphins, eagles are greatly admired, and worms and snails and toads are probably despised, and not to mention spiders and snakes. So we project a lot of our values onto nature. I know that there have been experiments in interspecies communication across virtually the entire spectrum. Many years ago, I did a radio interview with a musician who would go and play music out on a turkey farm, and the turkeys would sort of participate musically with him.
Well, yes, and of course there's been many, many examples of people going out playing violins or even broadcasting recorded music on cliffs, and the dolphins and the whales come to listen to this music. So it seems like other species are very interested in harmony, and rather than cacophony. There's also, I remember seeing a movie some years ago called The Wild Parrots of Telegraph Hill, a documentary about parrots. And in that movie, there's a guy playing a guitar with an image of a parrot bouncing away in rhythm to his music. And up until that moment, I wasn't aware that other species besides humans actually feel and respond to rhythm, and he did. It was wonderful to see that.
If you go on YouTube, there are probably hundreds of
by now,
such.
yes,
I recall watching a parrot dance to Ray Charles singing "Shake a Tail Feather."
Okay, I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much of this going on, and yet when you received what appeared to you to be a deeply profound and detailed communication, the message had to do with a real political, ecological, social issue that the planet is facing.
I'm sorry, yes?
No, go ahead. I want you to follow up on that.
Well, very much so. And also another key message in that interchange was that the cetaceans, the dolphins and the whales, people, as natives would call them, native indigenous peoples would call them, were grieving that the human species in general, obviously there are exceptions, but in general the human species is no longer willing to participate and recognize and communicate with the dolphins. And the implication was that in the past, our species in general was much more open to interspecies communication than we are today. And that because we have withdrawn our participation in the ecological harmony that we were talking about earlier, that we are actually a drag on evolution. that the human species is in some ways, by not participating with the other species, and in this case particularly with the cetaceans, with the dolphins and the whales, we're slowing their process of evolution as well as our own process of evolution. So the message there was that for us to have either accelerate or to just allow the free flow of evolution, we need to be open to interspecies communication. Mm-hmm. We are all in this together as species.
Yeah. Let's talk for a moment about your philosophical view of panpsychism and how that relates to the notion of interspecies communication.
Well, yes, and of course what that would mean is that interspecies, in this case, panpsychism, by the way, is the philosophy that says consciousness exists in matter and energy intrinsically, all the way down, that there is no level of the physical world where consciousness doesn't exist. So it means that all species have consciousness, but all species doesn't just mean animals, it means bacteria, single cells, in fact, even non-living species like molecules and atoms, subatomic particles, that there's some degree, some trace of consciousness everywhere. That means that nature itself is teeming with intelligence, teeming with consciousness, teeming with sentience, and that we are part of that. We are part of that symphony of intelligence of the natural world, and that it's up to us to play our part and to not play out of tune. I would say that in some ways for 400 or 500 years, and who knows, maybe it goes even further back than that the human species is playing out of tune with the rest of the natural world.
There are many examples going back to the ancient Greeks and the Polynesian people where dolphins have come to rescue humans. In fact, the Maori natives of New Zealand believe that they were guided to New Zealand from other islands where they originated and were guided there by dolphins. They consider themselves the people of the dolphin.
I'm completely open to that possibility. One thing I think we have to keep in mind is that we as a human species have been on this planet for, who knows, 1 million years, give or take. Dolphins have been around for at least 50 million years in the oceans, and they have been evolving to adapt to their environment for 50 million years. And that we know now through neuroatomical and neuroscientific investigation that the brains of dolphins are at least, if not more complex, they're certainly larger than human brains. And the idea that they don't have intelligence comparable to ours it just flies in the face of the evidence that we have. So we've got to realize that there are highly intelligent species and quite possibly way more intelligent than humans. Somebody once said very recently that, well, if humans are so intelligent, then why don't they rule the world? And I love the response. Somebody said, that's an example of their intelligence.
You mean if dolphins were so intelligent?
If dolphins were so, yes. If dolphins were so intelligent, why don't they rule the world? Right. And the answer was, that's because they are so intelligent that they don't have the motivation of the need to rule the world.
Yes, in fact, the very idea that humans form pyramidal structures with alpha males typically at the top of these structures, and that they fight each other constantly and compete with each other constantly may not at all be the sign of an intelligent species.
Well, no, we do know, too, that most dolphin species are matriarchal societies, and of course there were evidence of that, too, in the early days of human species. So there seems to be something problematic with patriarchal societies. That, of course, that's not just unique to humans. We see that in other species, too, in our apes and other. I think elephants are matriarchal species as well.
Let me just share with you one other dolphin story.
Yes, please.
If I may. Many years ago, I was part of an organization called the New Frontiers Institute, and we engaged in sort of a telepathic, hypnotic, remote viewing process where a group of people would go into a trance state and then go on journeys together and communicate with each other what they were experiencing. And so in this example, we said as a group, let's visit Marine World, which was in Redwood City in those days, back in the San Francisco Bay Area. We visited and we said, let's go to see a dolphin. And people were saying, well, we're in a dolphin tank and here is a female dolphin all by herself, separated from her mate and very lonely and unhappy, and wants us to rescue her. And her name is D, or begins with D. All this was recorded on audio tape. And later on, members of the group said, well, we ought to check out and visit Marine World and see if there's anything that resembled what we experienced. This is something that could be veridical.
Right.
We did, in fact, visit Marine World and learned to our delight that there was a female dolphin named Dondi who was exactly in this situation, separated from her mate, not participating in the dolphin show. And the dolphin trainers were very open to working with us and to learning about this experience. They understood that this kind of communication with a dolphin would be possible. So they invited us to come and see if we could work with Dondi. We set up video cameras and gave Dondi what we thought were telepathic instructions with the help of the dolphin trainers to perform various tricks in order to demonstrate that this kind of communication was real. And in fact, Dondi began responding and actually performing on cue in response to telepathic messages, various tricks that she had been taught earlier by the dolphin trainers. And as a result, she got back into the regular dolphin show. Now, we were never able to rescue her, but what we were able to do, at least to our satisfaction and the satisfaction of the dolphin trainers back then, was show that this kind of human telepathic interaction with humans and dolphins could be demonstrated.
Well, that's fascinating because, that one of the key elements in the story of Deep Spirit is that the interspecies anthropologist is thinking that she's training the dolphin to communicate with humans. It turns out later on in the story that actually the dolphin is training the humans, because what the dolphin wants to do is to motivate the humans to release him back into the ocean.
Yeah, very, very similar. And I mentioned earlier Wade Doak, the author of Dolphin. He came to the conclusion that instead of researching the dolphins, although he was a naturalist, what he wanted to do was let the dolphins research him.
Wonderful. That's a nice example of a theme occurring in real life that then occurred again in this novel that I wrote.
Well, Christian de Quincey, it's been a pleasure sharing this interspecies communication journey with you. I know this material seems rather far out, but you are a well-grounded individual, a deep thinker, a philosopher, and I think the discussion may encourage people to think twice about concepts they might well dismiss out of hand.
Well, thank you, and I just want to emphasize that I'm not encouraging people to either believe or disbelieve the content of what I've been saying, but to be open to that possibility.
Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.